The air in the conference room was as cold and heavy as the polished granite tombstone that now bore Robert Davenport's name. For his widow Catherine, every ticking second of the grandfather clock in the corner was a hammer blow to her already shattered heart. She was supposed to be grieving in the quiet solitude of their cavernous home, surrounded by 40 years of memories. Instead, she was here, summoned to a reading of a will she never knew existed, facing a woman whose perfume was a declaration of war. A woman who had been her husband's secret, but Catherine was about to learn that Robert had one last secret, a final, devastating move from beyond the grave that would expose a lie so monstrous, it would make a mockery of everyone's grief and greed. Catherine Davenport sat with a ramrod straight posture that belied the tremor in her hands. She clutched her black leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white, the only betrayer of the maelstrom churning within her. The room itself felt like an extension of her grief, old, suffocating, and reeking of finality. The walls were paneled with dark mahogany, lined with leather-bound books that hadn't been touched in a generation. The long, imposing table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the grim faces of those assembled. At her side was her son, William. At 35, he was the spitting image of his father in his youth, the same determined jaw, the same deep-set blue eyes. But today those eyes were clouded with a mixture of sorrow and a simmering anger she didn't yet understand. He had been distant since Robert's sudden, massive heart attack 2 weeks ago, offering clipped formal condolences as if she were a business acquaintance rather than the mother who had raised him. Across from them sat Judge Lawrence Peterson, the executor of Robert's estate, a man whose face seemed carved from old oak, weathered and unyielding. He had been Robert's friend since their university days, a fixture at family Christmases and summer barbecues. Yet today his gaze was impartial, professional, giving away nothing. He adjusted his spectacles, the soft rustle of paper, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Then the door opened. The woman who entered was everything Catherine was not. Where Catherine was draped in understated, elegant mourning black, this woman was a slash of crimson in a tight-fitting dress that clung to a figure honed by personal trainers and ambition. Her hair was a cascade of artificial blonde, her makeup a perfect, impenetrable mask. Her name was Bridget Monroe, and her very presence was an act of desecration. Catherine had only learned of Bridget's existence through a sympathy card sent to the house, a card signed with a familiarity that had turned her blood to ice. He was the love of my life, my deepest sympathies for your loss. B. The single initial was an act of supreme arrogance, a branding iron on Catherine's pain. Bridget didn't so much as glance at Catherine. Her eyes, sharp and predatory, were fixed on the empty chair beside Judge Peterson, a seat she took with the entitlement of a queen claiming her throne. She placed a vibrant red crocodile skin purse on the table, the snap of its clasp echoing like a gunshot. "Let's get this over with, Lawrence," Bridget said, her voice a low, husky purr that grated on Catherine's nerves. Using his first name, so familiar, so practiced. William stiffened beside Catherine. "Show some respect," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Bridget turned her head slowly, a condescending smirk playing on her perfectly painted lips. "Respect? Oh, darling, I respected Robert more than anyone. I knew the real him, not the tired old man who played the part of the perfect husband." Catherine flinched as if struck. The words were meant to wound, and they found their mark with surgical precision. She felt a wave of nausea. 40 years of marriage, of shared laughter and silent struggles, of raising a son and building an empire in construction, Davenport and Sons. Was it all just a part he was playing? "That's enough, both of you," Judge Peterson said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the room. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the document before him. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Robert Charles Davenport, dated 6 months ago. This document supersedes all previous versions." 6 months ago? The timing was a dagger. That was when Robert had started working late, when the unexplained business trips had become more frequent. Catherine had attributed it to a stressful new project, a downtown skyscraper development. She had been a fool, a trusting, naive fool. She looked at her son, hoping for an ally, a flicker of shared indignation. But William wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the polished surface of the table, his jaw clenched. Was he angry at his father, or at her for not seeing what was happening? Bridget, meanwhile, leaned forward slightly, a glint of victory in her eyes. She crossed her legs, the whisper of nylon a sound of pure confidence. She was here for her prize, the spoils of a war Catherine hadn't even known she was fighting. Catherine took a deep, shuddering breath, steeling herself. She had survived the sudden death of her husband. She had planned a funeral attended by hundreds, shaking hands and accepting condolences while her world crumbled around her. She could survive this. She had to. For Robert's memory, for her son, for the 40 years that Bridget Monroe was so determined to erase. The judge began to read, his voice a monotonous drone that laid out the initial bequests. Small donations to charities, sentimental items to old friends. Each word felt like a shovelful of dirt on her husband's coffin. And with every sentence, the tension in the room coiled tighter, a spring being wound to its breaking point. Catherine knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the worst was yet to come. The real reading, the one that would define the rest of her life, had not yet begun. Judge Peterson read through the preamble and the minor bequests with the dispassionate tone of a man reading a weather report. He bequeathed Robert's antique watch collection to a nephew, his library of first-edition history books to his alma mater, and set up a generous trust for the longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. Each was a small, predictable act of a man tying up loose ends. For Catherine, they were ghosts of a life that felt a million miles away. She remembered Robert showing off that Patek Philippe watch at their anniversary dinner, the pride in his eyes. She remembered the scent of old paper and leather in his study as he pored over his books. Bridget listened with an air of bored tolerance, tapping a long, crimson-nailed finger on the table. This was the opening act, the fluff before the main event. Her main event. Catherine's own name was mentioned early. To my wife, Catherine Marie Davenport, I leave my personal effects not otherwise specified, and the marital home on Hallowell Drive, with the grounds and all its contents, to be hers for the duration of her natural life, free and clear of all encumbrances. A wave of cold relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. The house, her sanctuary, the place where she'd raised William, where every corner held a memory. It was hers. For a fleeting moment, she thought perhaps this wouldn't be the public humiliation she had feared. Perhaps Robert, in his final moments of planning, had retained some shred of decency, some respect for their shared history. The thought died as soon as it was born. A life estate, Bridget murmured, just loud enough for everyone to hear. The words were laced with poison. So generous. She gets to be the live-in caretaker of my property. William's head snapped up. What did you say? Quiet, William, Bridget cooed, waving a dismissive hand. The grown-ups are talking. Judge Peterson shot a stern glare over the rim of his glasses. Ms. Monroe, another outburst, and I will have you removed. Bridget simply smiled, a thin, cruel slash of red. My apologies, Lawrence. Please continue. I'm eager to hear the rest. The judge returned to the will, his voice a low rumble. He detailed the corporate structure of Davenport and Sons Construction, the company Robert had inherited from his father and built into a titan of the industry. Catherine had always been a silent partner, the supportive spouse who hosted dinner parties for clients and endured lonely nights while Robert worked. She owned a nominal share, a token of their partnership, but Robert had always held the controlling interest. Regarding my 51% controlling interest in Davenport and Sons Construction, LLC, the judge read, pausing for a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. Catherine held her breath. This was the heart of it all. The company was Robert's legacy, their family's future. It was William's birthright. Catherine glanced at her son. He was leaning forward now, his entire body rigid. This was his life's work. He'd started in the company mailroom as a teenager, worked his way through every department, earning the respect of the men on the ground and the executives in the boardroom. He was poised to take over, to carry the Davenport name into the next generation. It was the only thing that had ever made sense. The judge continued, and all associated assets, stock holdings, and capital accounts. I bequeath them in their entirety. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. Say William. Say your son's name. Bridget's smug smile widened. She looked like a cat that had not only cornered the canary, but had already swallowed it whole. To Ms. Bridget Monroe. The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a deep, dark well. For a moment, there was only the sound of Catherine's own blood roaring in her ears. It couldn't be. It was a mistake. A cruel, vicious joke. She looked at William. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked not at Bridget, but at Catherine, and in his gaze she saw a terrible, dawning accusation. You let this happen. You didn't see. Then the shock curdled into fury. No, William breathed, the word a ragged whisper. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. No, that's impossible. He would never. He promised me. Bridget let out a soft, theatrical sigh. Oh, William, promises are for little boys. Robert was a man, and he made a man's decision. He knew you weren't ready. You're too emotional, too sentimental. He needed someone with a killer instinct to protect his legacy. He needed me. You, William spat, his voice trembling with rage. You're a parasite. You leeched onto him. What did you do, blackmail him? Threaten him? William, sit down, Judge Peterson commanded, his voice sharp as steel. No, I will not sit down. William gestured wildly at Bridget. She's a gold-digging whore. My father would never hand his life's work over to her. Catherine felt frozen in her chair, a spectator at her own execution. The company, the legacy, William's future, all of it handed to this stranger, this viper in red. It was more than a betrayal. It was an annihilation. Robert hadn't just had an affair. He had dismantled their entire world, their shared past and their son's future, and handed the pieces to his mistress. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. Every happy memory was now tainted. Every sacrifice she'd made rendered meaningless. The man she had loved for 40 years was a monster. Through the haze of her agony, she heard Judge Peterson's voice, steady and relentless, as he continued reading the document that was systematically destroying her life. In addition to the controlling interest in Davenport and Sons, the will further provides for Ms. Monroe a liquid cash settlement of $20 million to be transferred from the primary estate account within 30 days. $20 million. The number was so absurd, so obscene, it barely registered. And finally, the judge intoned, sole ownership of the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, the vacation property in Aspen, and the entirety of the Davenport art collection. That was the final blow. The art collection. It wasn't just an investment. It was Catherine's passion. She had curated it with Robert over decades. Each painting, each sculpture, held a story of a trip they'd taken, a discovery they'd made together. A Degas ballerina they'd found in a small gallery in Paris on their 20th anniversary. A bold, abstract canvas by Rothko that Robert had initially hated but grew to love because it made her happy. Handing that collection to Bridget was not just giving away assets. It was stealing Catherine's memories and giving them to the woman who had helped her husband betray her. Catherine finally found her voice, a broken, fragile thing. Lawrence, how? Before the judge could answer, Bridget spoke, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. It's simple, Catherine. He loved me. He chose me. He knew who deserved to be rewarded for her devotion. She looked from Catherine's devastated face to William's enraged one and laughed, a low, triumphant, ugly sound. Face it, you've been replaced. The future is mine. Bridget Monroe savored the moment like a connoisseur tasting a rare vintage. The silence in the room was thick with Catherine's shattered dignity and William's impotent rage. It was the most exquisite sound she had ever heard. For months she had played a part, endured the company of a man she found boringly sentimental, all for this absolute, crushing victory. She leaned back in her chair, the picture of relaxed ownership. Well, she said, breaking the silence with a sigh of satisfaction, I must say, Robert really did think of everything. I'll need the keys to the Aspen house by the end of the week. I'm planning a small get-together to celebrate new beginnings. William took a step forward, his fist clenched at his sides. You will get nothing. Oh, but I will, Bridget countered, her voice smooth as silk. She gestured with a perfectly manicured hand towards Judge Peterson. It's all right here in black and white. A legally binding document. Isn't that right, Lawrence? Judge Peterson remained impassive, his expression unreadable. He simply stared at the will, his face a stony mask. His silence was, in its own way, an affirmation. Catherine felt a profound and desolate emptiness. The fight had gone out of her. What was there to fight for? The man she had built a life with had orchestrated this demolition from behind a veil of lies. The love she thought was the bedrock of her existence was nothing but sand. She looked at the expensive, tasteful black dress she wore, the simple strand of pearls at her neck, a gift from Robert on their 30th anniversary. It all felt like a costume for a life that had been a lie. She thought of the last few months. Robert had been distant, yes, but also sad. There was a weariness in his eyes she had mistaken for job-related stress. He'd hold her hand sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, with a strange intensity, as if he were trying to memorize the feel of it. I love you, Kat, he'd said, just a week before he died. Never forget that. Everything I do for you and William. How could those words coexist with this testament of cruelty? Had he been mocking her? Was his every action a calculated deception? I think, Bridget said, rising from her chair with a fluid, predatory grace, that my business here is concluded. William, I'll expect to see you at the office on Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. We'll need to discuss the transition of power. Don't be late. She smiled, a flash of white teeth. I'm your new boss, after all. The sheer audacity of the statement seemed to stun William into silence. He just stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and hatred. Bridget then turned her attention to Catherine. Her eyes, the color of cold jade, swept over Catherine's mourning attire with unconcealed disdain. And as for you, Catherine, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a word of advice. The Hallowell Drive house is large. You'll be rattling around in there all by yourself. Perhaps you should consider downsizing. A nice little condo somewhere. It would be more appropriate for your new station in life. Once you're gone, I think I'll have the whole place redecorated. It's so terribly dated. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking. It wasn't enough to take her husband, her security, her son's legacy, and her memories. Bridget had to grind salt into the wounds to assert her dominance over every facet of Catherine's past and future. This final insult, however, managed to pierce through Catherine's shock-induced paralysis. A spark of the formidable woman who had stood by Robert Davenport as he built his empire ignited within her. She rose slowly to her feet, her movements deliberate. She was shorter than Bridget, less ostentatious, but when she met the other woman's gaze, her eyes held the weight of 40 years of life, love, and now, loss. You will not touch my home, Catherine said, her voice low but vibrating with a strength she didn't know she still possessed. You will not speak to my son in that manner. You may have my husband's money, but you will never have his name. You will never have his history, and you will never ever have our respect. Bridget's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. She hadn't expected a fight. She had expected a broken old woman to dissolve into tears. Brave words from a woman with nothing, Bridget sneered. But they are just that, words. I have the will. I have the power. I have everything that was yours. And you, she said, leaning in closer, have nothing but an old house full of ghosts. She turned to leave, her victory seemingly complete. She picked up her crocodile skin purse, ready to walk out into her new, fabulously wealthy life. William looked on, defeated. Catherine felt the last of her strength begin to ebb away, the brief flicker of defiance dying in the face of Bridget's absolute triumph. This was it. This was the end of her world. Ms. Monroe, a voice boomed, cutting through the thick atmosphere of despair. It was Judge Peterson. He hadn't moved. He hadn't packed up the will. He was still staring at the document, his finger resting on a particular paragraph near the end. Bridget paused at the door, her back to the room. "What is it, Lawrence? Are there more assets you forgot to mention?" she asked, her voice dripping with avarice. "Please take your seat," the judge said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. "I am not finished." A frown creased Bridget's brow. "I think you are. The important parts have been covered." "On the contrary," Judge Peterson said, his voice taking on a new hard edge. He looked up from the will, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't impartial. He looked directly at Bridget, and his eyes were chips of ice. "The most important part is yet to come. Please, sit down." Something in his tone, a cold, menacing finality, made the hairs on Catherine's arms stand up. William, who had been slumped in defeat, straightened up, a glimmer of confusion and hope in his eyes. Reluctantly, with a huff of exasperation, Bridget walked back to the table and sank into her chair. "Fine," she snapped, "but make it quick. I have a champagne tasting to get to." Judge Peterson ignored her. He carefully flattened the last page of the will on the table. "As I was saying," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "I am not finished. There is one final section. It is titled Contingency Clause and Final Verification." A new kind of silence fell over the room. It was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence from before, nor the shocked silence that had followed the main bequests. This was a taut, anxious quiet, buzzing with unspoken questions. Bridget shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by a sliver of irritation. A contingency clause? What on earth for? Robert was perfectly clear. He wanted me to have everything. He was indeed very clear, Judge Peterson agreed, his voice dangerously level. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the final page. His tone was no longer that of a dispassionate executor. It was the voice of a judge about to deliver a sentence. "The bequests made herein to Miss Bridget Monroe," he began, his voice resonating with the weight of Robert's own words, "are predicated entirely on the truthfulness and sincerity of the relationship upon which they are based. They are a reward for what I was led to believe was genuine love, affection, and companionship during the final year of my life." Bridget nodded smugly. "Exactly. He loved me. We were devoted to each other." Judge Peterson held up a hand to silence her, his eyes never leaving the page. "Let me continue. Therefore, these bequests are contingent upon one final, simple condition. This condition must be met and verified by my executor, Lawrence Peterson, before any assets, titles, or funds are transferred." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Catherine's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. William leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the judge, his whole body coiled like a spring. "The condition is this," the judge read, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them all in, "that Ms. Bridget Monroe provide to my executor conclusive, irrefutable proof of the paternity of her unborn child. The child she claimed, to me and in writing, was mine." The air was sucked out of the room. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Unborn child? Bridget was pregnant? With Robert's baby? This was a fresh hell, a new layer of betrayal so profound it was almost surreal. She stared at Bridget's perfectly flat stomach, hidden beneath the tight crimson dress. There was no sign, no hint. Bridget's face had gone chalk white beneath her expensive foundation. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of frozen panic. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape. What is this?" she stammered, her husky voice now thin and reedy. "A child? That's a private matter." "According to this document," Judge Peterson said, tapping the will with a stern finger, "it is a multi-million-dollar matter. Robert's words are very specific. He writes, Bridget informed me of her pregnancy on the 3rd of April. It was this news that prompted me to redraft my will to ensure that my child and its mother would be cared for in perpetuity. The 3rd of April. Catherine remembered that day. Robert had come home late, looking pale and distracted. He had poured himself a stiff scotch and stood by the window for almost an hour, staring out into the darkness. She had asked him what was wrong. "Just complex negotiations, Cat," he had said. Nothing for you to worry about. Oh, Robert, what had you gotten yourself into? This is ridiculous, Bridget shrieked, her composure finally shattering. She jumped to her feet, her chair clattering behind her. This is an invasion of my privacy. You can't demand such a thing. I'm afraid we can, Judge Peterson said calmly. And we must. The will is explicit. No proof, no inheritance. It all becomes void. He looked at her, his expression grim. So, Ms. Monroe, can you provide the proof, a doctor's report, a sonogram, anything to substantiate the claim upon which this entire inheritance is built? Bridget's eyes were wild. I had a miscarriage, she blurted out, the lie clumsy and transparent. It was recent. I was too devastated to speak of it. It's cruel to bring it up now. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, or disgust, crossed the judge's face. He slowly shook his head. That is unfortunate. However, Robert, it seems, anticipated such a possibility. He turned a page. He writes here, in the tragic event of a miscarriage, the bequest shall stand, provided Ms. Monroe can supply medical records confirming the pregnancy and its subsequent loss. These records must be from a licensed obstetrician and dated prior to my death. Checkmate. Bridget stood there, trembling, her face a mess of fury and desperation. The trap was elegant, brilliant, and utterly inescapable. There were no records. There had never been a baby. The foundation of her entire claim had just crumbled into dust. She pointed a shaking finger at the will. This is a trick. It's a forgery. Catherine and William put you up to this. Judge Peterson's face hardened into granite. He slowly removed his spectacles and placed them on the table. He looked directly at Bridget Monroe, and the full weight of his judicial authority, his friendship with the deceased, and his moral outrage descended upon her. Ms. Monroe, he said, and his voice was no longer just the voice of an executor. It was the voice of judgment itself. I have in my possession a file compiled by a private investigator hired by Robert Davenport 3 months ago. This file contains recorded telephone conversations of you bragging to a friend about your foolproof plan. It contains financial records showing payments from you to a Mr. Albie Finch, a known forger, for the creation of a fake sonogram report. It contains a sworn, notarized affidavit from Robert himself, detailing your repeated financial demands and the threats you made to go public with your fabricated story if he didn't comply. He let that sink in, watching as the last vestiges of color drained from Bridget's face. Robert knew, Judge Peterson stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. He knew for months. He didn't change his will to reward you. He changed it to expose you. Every asset listed, every dollar promised, was nothing more than bait in an elaborate and inescapable trap. He paused, letting the full gravity of the revelation settle upon the room. Catherine stared, breathless, as the entire narrative of the past hour and the past year was violently, beautifully rewritten. Robert wasn't a fool. He wasn't a traitor. He was a protector. He had been fighting a silent battle she knew nothing about. Judge Peterson leaned forward, his eyes boring into the now sobbing woman. Therefore, Miss Monroe, as the executor of this estate, and based on the overwhelming evidence compiled by the deceased, I must inform you that all bequests made to you are null and void. The condition has not been met. It cannot be met, because there was no baby. There was no love. There was only extortion and greed. He delivered the final devastating verdict, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. You, Ms. Monroe, are a fraud. The word fraud hung in the air, electric and immutable. Bridget Monroe did not just gasp or cry, she screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated rage, the shriek of a predator whose prey had not only escaped, but had turned and ripped out its throat. Lies, she howled, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into a grotesque mask of fury. It's all lies. He loved me. That old man loved me. You can't do this. Judge Peterson simply gestured to 2 uniformed security officers who had been waiting discreetly in the hallway. They entered the room, their presence large and uncompromising. This meeting is for beneficiaries only, the judge said, his voice cold as a winter morning. You, Ms. Monroe, are no longer a beneficiary. Please escort the lady out. Bridget struggled as the officers took her by the arms. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers. This is illegal. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you," she shrieked, her crimson dress twisting as she fought them. Her eyes, wild and venomous, locked onto Catherine. "You think you've won, you old hag. He still came to me. He still betrayed you." Her voice echoed down the hall as she was forcibly removed, a litany of curses and threats fading into the distance until the heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. Catherine sank back into her chair, her body trembling with the aftershock. Her mind was a whirlwind, trying to process the violent reversal of fortune. Robert, her Robert, had orchestrated this. The will wasn't an instrument of his betrayal, but of his protection. The pain of the last hour, the gut-wrenching belief that her marriage had been a lie, was replaced by a wave of something far more complex. A mixture of overwhelming relief, profound grief for the secret battle he had fought alone, and a fierce, burning love for the man who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to shield his family. William was the first to speak, his voice choked with emotion. He looked at Judge Peterson, his eyes wide with a question he could barely articulate. "Lawrence, is this true? All of it?" The judge nodded grimly. He opened a thick leather briefcase on the table and pulled out a heavy file, placing it in the center of the table. "This is the file I mentioned. Robert brought it to me 2 months ago. He gave me specific instructions. He told me, let her think she's won. Let her gloat. The higher she flies, the harder she'll fall. I want my family to see what she is, and I want it to be undeniable." William reached out a trembling hand and opened the file. Inside were glossy photographs, transcripts of conversations, and detailed financial reports. Catherine could see a photo of Bridget meeting a small, weaselly-looking man in a diner, presumably the forger, Albie Finch. "Robert was in a terrible position," Judge Peterson explained, his voice softening with the memory of his friend's distress. "When Ms. Monroe first made her claim of pregnancy, he was devastated. He truly believed her, for a short while. He felt a sense of duty, misplaced as it was. But something about her story, her immediate demands for financial assurances, raised his suspicions." He continued, painting a picture of Robert's silent investigation. "He hired a man named Conrad Wells, a very discreet and very thorough private investigator. Within a few weeks, Wells uncovered her history. Bridget Monroe, or whatever her real name is, has a pattern. She targets wealthy, recently retired or widowed men. Men who are often lonely and vulnerable. She manufactures a relationship, fakes a crisis, usually a pregnancy or a sick relative, and then extorts them for a quiet settlement." "But Robert wasn't a widower. He had me," Catherine whispered, the words catching in her throat. "And he knew it," the judge affirmed. "That's what made him fight back. According to his affidavit, Ms. Monroe threatened to create a massive public scandal. She would claim he'd been having a long-term affair and was now abandoning his pregnant mistress. In today's media landscape, the accusation alone would have been enough to tarnish his reputation and damage the company he spent his life building. He knew it would humiliate you and William. So he played her game. The late nights at the office weren't trysts. They were strategy sessions with his lawyer and investigator. The business trips were clandestine meetings to gather evidence. He had worn a mask of the guilty, cheating husband to disarm his enemy, all while secretly forging the weapon that would destroy her. "The will," William murmured, finally understanding. "It was the perfect trap. By putting everything in the will, he forced her to expose her lie in the most public, legally binding way possible. If she'd just taken a settlement and ran, she might have gotten away with it. But she was too greedy. She wanted it all." "Precisely," Judge Peterson said. "He knew her greed would be her undoing. He used it against her." The judge then reached back into his briefcase and pulled out another, much slimmer envelope, sealed with wax bearing the Davenport family crest. "Robert left this as well," he said, sliding it across the polished table to Catherine. "He instructed me to give it to you only after the truth about Miss Monroe had been revealed." Catherine's hands shook as she took the envelope. It was addressed simply to Kat in Robert's familiar, strong handwriting. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a letter. "My dearest Kat, If you are reading this, then it means my gambit has worked and that venomous woman is out of our lives for good. It also means that I am gone, and for that, my love, I am more sorry than words can ever say. I can only imagine the pain you have endured today, listening to that will. I am agonizingly aware that to protect you, I first had to inflict a terrible wound. To make the trap believable, I had to appear to be the very thing I despise, a traitor to our family and to our love. Please, please believe me when I say that every lie, every moment of distance in these last months was a torment. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. There was no affair. I was never unfaithful to you. Not once in 40 years. My heart has only ever been yours. This woman was a predator, and I was her target. When she threatened to destroy our family's name and legacy with her lies, I saw only one way out. Not to pay her off and let her hold this over us forever, but to beat her at her own game. To create a lie so big it would ultimately expose her truth. I am sorry I could not tell you. To involve you would have put you in danger and made the act impossible to maintain. This was a battle I had to fight alone. My only regret is that I will not be there to hold you now, to help you heal from the wounds I inflicted as a necessary evil. Everything I have ever built, I built for you and for William. You are my life's work, my true legacy. The company is just steel and glass. Forgive me for the pain. Remember me for the love. It was always only for you. Yours forever, Robert. Tears streamed down Catherine's face, but they were no longer tears of pain or betrayal. They were tears of grief, of love, of a profound and aching understanding. She clutched the letter to her chest, the thin paper a final, precious connection to the man she had loved. The man who had loved her enough to become a monster in her eyes just to protect her. William came around the table and knelt beside her chair, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Mom," he said, his own voice thick with tears, "I'm so sorry. I doubted him. I doubted us." Catherine reached up and covered his hand with her own. "He did it for us, William," she whispered through her tears. "He did it all for us." Judge Peterson watched the reunion, a look of solemn satisfaction on his face. He cleared his throat gently. "There is one more thing," he said, picking up the now invalid will. "As all bequests to Ms. Monroe have been voided, the estate now falls to the residual clause." He turned to the very last sentence on the page. "In the event the contingency clause is not met, the entire estate, including all personal, financial, and corporate assets, without exception, is to be divided equally between my beloved wife, Catherine Davenport, and my son, William Davenport." He looked up at them, a small, genuine smile finally gracing his features. "The company is yours, William. The legacy is safe. Everything is as it should be." The revelation settled over the room, not with the explosive shock of the previous disclosures, but with the quiet, profound weight of truth. The storm had passed. The fraud had been exposed, the enemy vanquished by a dead man's brilliant, posthumous strategy. What remained was the quiet aftermath, the task of piecing together a world that had been torn apart and then, miraculously, made whole again. Catherine held Robert's letter in one hand and her son's hand in the other, the two tangible proofs of her true inheritance. The paper felt like a sacred text, the warmth of William's grip a promise of the future. The money, the company, the properties, they were secondary now. The real inheritance was the reclamation of her past, the validation of her 40-year marriage. Robert hadn't abandoned her, he had armored her. William rose from his kneeling position and returned to his seat, though he seemed different now. The anger and suspicion that had hardened his features had melted away, replaced by a deep, contemplative sorrow and a newfound respect for the father he thought he'd lost twice, once to death and once to betrayal. "He thought of everything," William said in awe, looking at Judge Peterson. "He laid it all out like a chess match. He knew she'd be arrogant enough to come here. He knew she'd gloat. He anticipated the miscarriage lie. My God, he was always 10 steps ahead. He was the most formidable man I ever knew," Judge Peterson agreed, "and he loved his family with a ferocity that I've seldom witnessed. This entire affair, it took a tremendous toll on him. In my last meeting with him, he looked exhausted. He told me he felt like he was living a double life, and the stress was eating him alive. Catherine's heart ached. The doctor had said his heart attack was sudden, massive, and likely brought on by extreme stress. She finally understood. The fight to protect his family had literally cost him his life. He had shielded them from the battle, but he had absorbed every blow himself. The knowledge was both a comfort and a fresh source of grief. "This file," William said, gesturing to the damning evidence against Bridget. "What happens with this? What happens to her?" Robert's instructions were clear on that as well, the judge replied, his professional demeanor returning. He did not wish for a public spectacle. His goal was not revenge, but protection. He wanted her neutralized, not martyred. However, the evidence of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy is overwhelming. I have already been in contact with the district attorney's office. They are very interested in Ms. Monroe and her associate, Mr. Finch. Her assets, which our investigation shows were acquired from other victims, will be frozen pending a criminal investigation. She will not be bothering anyone again for a very long time. There was a quiet finality to his words. Bridget Monroe had been erased from their lives as completely as if she had never existed. Catherine finally lowered Robert's letter, folding it carefully and placing it in her handbag. It was a private treasure, not for this cold, mahogany-paneled room. She looked across the table at the old family friend who had guided them through this tempest. "Thank you, Lawrence," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time that day. "Thank you for honoring Robert's wishes, for everything." "It was my honor, Catherine," he said softly. "He was my friend." The formal business was concluded. Judge Peterson began packing his briefcase, the rustle of papers a final punctuation mark on the day's drama. The will that had been a weapon of torture was now just a stack of paper, its power expended, its purpose fulfilled. As Catherine and William stood to leave, a profound shift had occurred between them. The chasm that had opened up, born of William's grief and Catherine's perceived ignorance, had closed. They were a unit again, bound by a shared, secret history and a renewed understanding of the man they had both loved. William put his arm around his mother's shoulders as they walked toward the door. "He trusted you to take over the company," Catherine said, looking up at her son. "He knew you were ready." William shook his head. "No, that's not quite right. He knew we were ready. He left it to both of us, Mom. 50-50, a partnership, just like you and him." Catherine stopped, the truth of his words sinking in. Robert hadn't just handed the company to William. He had made her a full partner. It wasn't a token share anymore. It was a controlling interest, a seat at the head of the table. It was the ultimate vote of confidence, the final acknowledgement of the silent, steadfast role she had always played. He was ensuring she would not be a lonely widow rattling around in a big house. He was giving her a new purpose, a new role to step into. He was making her the matriarch of the Davenport legacy in fact, as well as in spirit. A small smile touched her lips. "Well then," she said, her voice filled with a resolve she hadn't felt in years, "it seems we have a company to run." As they stepped out of the stuffy law office and into the bright afternoon sun, the city of New York bustled around them, a symphony of life and commerce. For the first time since Robert's death, the future didn't feel like a terrifying, empty void. It felt like a challenge, an opportunity. It felt like a legacy waiting to be continued. The true inheritance wasn't just about assets on a balance sheet. It was about the strength they had discovered, the truth that had been salvaged from the fire, and the enduring power of a family that refused to be broken. 1 month later, Catherine Davenport walked into the main boardroom of Davenport & Sons Construction. The room was much like the lawyer's office, long, imposing, and paneled in dark wood. But instead of smelling of dust and finality, it smelled of possibility and fresh coffee. At the head of the long table was a large empty leather chair. Robert's chair. For a moment she hesitated at the threshold, the ghost of her husband's presence a palpable force. She could almost see him there, commanding the room with his easy authority, a blueprint spread before him, his eyes alight with the passion of creation. Then William's voice cut through her reverie. "You're late for your first board meeting, Madam Chairwoman." He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling cityscape, a view of the very buildings his father and grandfather had erected. He was wearing a sharp suit, but the grief and anger were gone from his eyes, replaced with a calm focus she hadn't seen in him before. He was no longer the grieving son. He was the CEO. Catherine smiled and walked toward the table. Co-chair, she corrected gently. The other board members, old friends and colleagues of Robert's, who had initially been wary of the transition, rose to their feet as she entered. There was a new respect in their eyes. The story of the will reading, though kept from the press, had circulated quietly within the company's inner sanctum. They now understood that the quiet, elegant Mrs. Davenport was not to be underestimated. She was the wife of a brilliant strategist and, it was becoming clear, a formidable woman in her own right. She did not take Robert's chair. Instead, she took the seat to its right, leaving the head of the table symbolically empty, a gesture of respect and remembrance. William took the seat to the left. Together, they flanked the memory of the man who had brought them to this point. The meeting began. William, with a confidence that made Catherine's heart swell with pride, laid out his vision for the future. He spoke of new projects, of sustainable building practices, of expanding into new markets. He was his father's son, but he had his own ideas, his own voice. When he was finished, he turned to Catherine. "Mom, anything to add?" All eyes turned to her. In the past, she would have demurred, offering a simple, supportive smile. Today was different. She had spent the last month not just grieving, but learning. She had pored over company financials, met with department heads, and read every proposal. She had found a new purpose in the nuts and bolts of the empire Robert had left them. "William's vision for growth is exactly what this company needs," she began, her voice steady and clear. "But a skyscraper is only as strong as its foundation. I want to propose the establishment of the Davenport Foundation, a new charitable arm of the company. It will focus on providing scholarships for engineering and architecture students from underprivileged backgrounds and funding for community housing projects. Our legacy shouldn't just be in the skyline. It should be on the ground, lifting people up." A murmur of approval went around the room. It was a brilliant move, honoring the past while investing in the future, generating goodwill, and giving the corporate behemoth a human heart. It was her idea, born from her own values, and it fit perfectly with William's strategy. They were a team. After the meeting, as the board members filed out, offering their congratulations, Catherine and William stood alone by the window, looking out at the city. "He would be so proud of you, William," Catherine said softly. "He'd be proud of us," William corrected, placing his arm around her. "You were amazing in there, Mom. You found your voice." "I had it all along," she replied, a newfound strength resonating in her words. "I just never had a reason to use it this way before." Her life as she knew it had ended the day Robert died, and it had ended again in that lawyer's office when she believed he had betrayed her. But from those ashes, something new was being built. A new relationship with her son, a new purpose for herself, and a new chapter for the Davenport name. The grief for Robert was still there, a quiet ache that she knew would never fully disappear. But it was no longer a crushing weight. It was a part of her, a reminder of a great love and a great sacrifice. He had left her more than just wealth and property. He had left her a final, incredible gift, the chance to discover her own strength. He had protected his queen, and in doing so, had made sure she was ready to rule. Looking out at the city, at the monuments of steel and glass her family had built, Catherine Davenport knew, with absolute certainty, that their foundation was stronger than ever. Catherine's story is a powerful testament to the fact that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the light. It's a journey through the darkest valleys of betrayal and grief, only to emerge into the sunlit highlands of justice and vindication. It reminds us that the people we love can be more complex and courageous than we ever imagined, and that true strength is often forged in the fires of deception. Robert's final act wasn't one of infidelity, but of fierce ultimate protection, a brilliant gambit from beyond the grave to secure his family's future and expose a vicious fraud. If this story of resilience, hidden love, and ultimate justice resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story where the truth wins in the end. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next real-life drama. What did you think of Robert's plan? Let us know in the comments below.